Going on, everybody? Back for the week. Kevin Cole here. Unexpected Points podcast / live stream. Going to be doing something a little similar today, which is take some questions, talk about some news from the week, although there's really no news. I mean, unless you want to dive deep into the Atlanta Falcons being docked a 5th round pick for the fact that they, I don't know, it sounds like they directly talked to Kirk Cousins about his travel arrangements after the contract had already been signed, and they were supposed to filter those only via his agent and not actually him. So tremendously huge nothing burger going on there with the Falcons and tampering. Did something actually happen that they didn't catch? I don't know. Maybe there's some, I'm sure there are some chats going on what is it, Signal? Is that the one that that people use where it's all encrypted and everything else? I'm sure there's stuff going on, obviously. And that's what makes it a little bit difficult to prosecute these cases, is when everyone knows there's some non-legal tampering going on before that 2-day window. So basically, it sounds like the Falcons talked to him directly during the 2-day legal tampering window after they already came to agreement about travel arrangements or something else is the main thing. So nothing burger there, 5th round pick. But there's not a lot going on. This is a downtime in the NFL season. But luckily, there are a couple of articles that came across my one useful feature, perhaps, for getting a blue check on the old X.com, the Twitter.com, which is articles that are being shared out there, either by people I follow or by people I follow who they follow. Most of the time, it's a bunch of political garbage. Guess what, guys? Donald Trump is bad. So most of the time, it's that sort of stuff. But when it comes to the people I follow, who they follow. But sometimes you get some good stuff here, and especially from the people who I follow. So 2 different articles came across today, just in the nick of time, that I can talk about. The one I'll spend the majority of my time on will be an article from Dan Graziano at ESPN, where he actually has 12 different GMs. I'm not sure if they're all on the record, but a lot of them are on the record to talk about roster building. Well, we'll go through that, what I agree with, what I don't agree with, for the takeaways there. So we'll go through that in some decent detail. But I want to start with a Bryce Young article by Nate Tice, formerly of The Athletic, now over at ESPN, where, I mean, it really just going to contrast it to how I would look at Bryce Young versus how Nate does. And it probably doesn't come as a huge surprise or anything, but I find my way of looking at him, while it might not be as visually and narratively evocative as a film analyst going through Bryce Young, it at least nails down something concrete as far as estimates are concerned. Now, maybe it's mislabeling to say it's a concrete estimate because it is a range of outcomes. So it's kind of a concrete uncertainty. If you could get that that kind of paradox in your mind here, is that it is an idea of what his range of outcomes can be and how we should view him, because a lot of the things that are going to come through in Nate Tice's film evaluation of like, well, he had this problem and he also had that problem. This was in his control. This wasn't his control. He flashed this. He didn't flash that. What you're really telling us is that, hey, there's a chance that he's still good, and there's a probably bigger chance that he's not good. But what does that mean for how we're going to look at things? I think I already did something on the different quarterbacks. I don't know. I'm having trouble finding it right now, honestly, about what we should expect for them going forward, some of the rookie quarterbacks, and our projections based upon my Bayesian modeling. I saw someone share it the other day where they were looking at Will Levis's range of outcomes that I had versus what I had for Bryce Young and CJ Stroud, and how you should view these guys differently. So that's how I do it. I display a range of outcomes. Let me see if I can actually look it up here to find what I did. Okay, here we go. Yeah, so I do have an article on here. Let me go ahead and share this article. So we'll talk just briefly about how I would lay out something like this, and then we can go into how Nate and probably the rest of the analyst world lays out these things. So I had an article. This is back in January. Maybe I should repump this up since people are more interested in this sort of stuff now, about how much do we know about Stroud, Young, and the rest of the 2023 quarterback class. And basically using this Bayesian updating, which looks at the inherent range of outcomes for quarterback quality over their careers, which I'm saying is kind of like their inherent abilities once you have a large enough sample size for for their kind of like true abilities. It looks at on a play by play basis what sort of variance there is, what sort of range of outcomes, what's the mean numbers there. It imputes a prior for each quarterback based upon where they're drafted. And then every time they have a play that affects this calculation, whether a drop back pass, scramble, or rushing play, it updates what we'd expect from them going forward. So if you have, let's say, 100 passes at a elite level of quarterback play, we're not going to say this is your stat, this is your elite level, that number represents who you are. We're going to say, well, it's only 100 passes, so we're going to move up off of our prior, but not that far. If you do it over 200 passes, if you do it over 300, if you do it over 1,000, 2,000, it continues to move further and further towards our expectation that you will perform in line with your evidence in the NFL going forward. So it's a way to combine like the uncertainty that we have, not really knowing a lot about these quarterbacks, the fact that quarterbacks underperform typically in their rookie year. So it's not the best year to project forward. It's much more solid to project a quarterback's second year forward for who they really are. And then it looked at offensive grades for PFF and EPA per play. So how I tried to look at it is just lay things out visually. So Young, if we look at all these different quarterbacks who had a minimum of 400 plays, I didn't want to include too many guys here as rookies from 2006 to 2023. 2006 is as far back as we can go for PFF grading. Young had basically tied with Gabbert for the second worst EPA per play. Josh Rosen in his own category. Another guy who would have been in his own category, who we'll talk about a little bit more later, is Jared Goff, but he actually didn't have that many plays. He didn't start playing until I think it was week 7 or week 8 in the NFL season. So that's one reason we should have actually been more positive on Goff going forward than someone who played an entire season, because we didn't have as much bad evidence. Like, more evidence is good for the projection when you have good performance, and more evidence is bad for your projection going forward when you have bad production. Whereas CJ Stroud was up in the category of guys who've done really well, but then also, he's right next to someone like Mac Jones. And I think that what you get directionally from this is we don't know for certain. It's not a perfect correlation between how a quarterback performs during his rookie season and how they will perform going forward. You do have the Matthew Staffords of the world who are very, very bad as rookies by PFF grading, also not just by EPA per play, but by PFF grading. Who were surrounded by your Blake Bortles of the world, Mark Sanchez, Deshaun Kaiser, Blaine Gabbert, those sorts of guys as rookies who obviously have ended up being a pretty high quality quarterback. But the vast majority of the guys are just not good. Zach Wilson's in there. Davis Mills is in there. Geno Smith, who, whatever we want to think about him anymore, he's in there. Trevor Lawrence is more towards the middle, but he's on the low side there. But the guys who are just bad, almost all of them ended up being bad. And then on the good side, for quarterbacks during this period, as far as grading is concerned, Russell Wilson was the best. And as far as efficiency for EPA per play is concerned, Dak Prescott was the best. But then, of course, you have an RG3 who fits right in the middle between those three, who wasn't successful. Then you have a Matt Ryan, pretty good career. Justin Herbert, looking pretty good so far. Mac Jones, not looking so good so far. Joe Burrow, looking pretty good. Baker Mayfield, has been good and then bad and then good and then bad and then now maybe looking okay again. And so on. So you don't have a lot, but there's definitely at least a directional force that we're looking at. And, again, I'm trying to just lay out this way in a perspective so you can get a perspective on them, and give you something where, you can maybe visually and then intellectually hold on to something a little bit more where you're looking at this. And then, one of the foundations of the analysis is just to look at range of outcomes that you can project. So every single time that you're projecting with Bayesian analysis, you're projecting what you believe their median or mean in this circumstance, because we're looking at a normal distribution. When you're looking at what that number will be going forward, it's also got a range of outcomes, and that range of outcomes narrows. It becomes thinner as you have more evidence. In other words, we become more confident that our best estimate is the actual truth, whereas we're not very confident on after a few throws or 100 throws and so on. So when you look at CJ Stroud and Bryce Young, there's still a lot of overlap in their distribution. So there are a lot of different circumstances, not a ton, not a majority, not even a 20% chance or something like that. But there are like different scenarios where, if Stroud ends up being worse than we thought, based upon his kind of median projection, and Young ends up being better than he thought, that Young could actually be better than Stroud. There's overlap between their two distributions, and that's what I show in here. But yet, if we look at their best estimate for Young, our best estimate is being under the 50th percentile for a franchise efficiency quarterback, pretty well under the 50th percentile, and quite a bit of his distribution is below the 25th percentile, so just being a really bad quarterback. And he's helped a lot by the fact that he's the first overall pick. Like, it would be a lot lower if he wasn't the first overall pick there. Whereas for CJ Stroud, we're looking at a quarterback who, in the terms of franchise quarterbacks, and I'm including anyone who had, I think it was 2,000 career dropbacks, is how I'm looking at that definition of with the range of outcomes for franchise quarterbacks. He's like more in the 75th, higher than the 75th percentile as his best estimate, and then he has quite a bit of his possible outcomes that are over the 90th percentile, where there's barely any for Stroud. And that's one of the big problems here. It's like, how often we're going to get that elite outcome that makes the big difference for quarterbacks going forward. And then I also looked at, Richardson and Levis, who have much wider distributions because of the fact that they don't have as much performance to go on. And then looking at scenarios specifically, and again, these numbers are all wrong, but they're a model and they're a guess and they're helpful. They're useful, right? They're not correct. These are not fully capturing every single aspect of quarterback play, but you look at it and you say, okay, out of these four quarterbacks, what's the likelihood that someone hits a 50th percentile outcome? For Stroud, it's much above 75%. For Richardson and Levis, it's above 50%. And then for Young, it's actually the lowest. And it's the lowest on all three just because we have so much more evidence for who he's been. And when you look at 75th and 90th percentile, even for CJ Stroud, we're still looking at a 25% chance of him being a 90th percentile type of quarterback. I think a lot of people are crowning him already, and that probably is premature based upon the one season. So that's how I would do it. This is just a broad overview of giving you some exact numbers. It's not as flashy. It doesn't show clips. It's not using, nuanced terms. But at least it gives you something you can dig your teeth into a little bit, and it's useful. Again, it's useful. And you can think about, well, maybe I would be a little bit less confident because of the specific situations that Stroud was in versus Young, and vice versa. You can kind of adjust mentally based upon that. But it gives you something that I believe is at least a little bit useful there. Now, when we go to Nate Tice's, this is kind of the more of, the typical thing that you're going to get as part of a analysis. So Nate's article, Bryce Young it's entitled Bryce Young's Hopes for a Bounce Back Season with Panthers Comes Down to More Than Just a Supporting Cast. A little wordy of a title for me, but okay. So, he goes on to document how everything was bad, leaky pockets, offensive line not knowing what they're doing. You get a couple of clips in here. And again, it's one of these situations where you say something like their botched assignments on seemingly every play, and then you give a couple of clips for your example. This is one of the things that like, give me some numbers. How often did someone really blow a block? Do you have access to stats on that? Seemingly every play. What does that mean? I don't know. But I guess I'm just not as enamored with making a statement, which you could probably back up with some sort of evidence. Like, I don't mind combining film analysis with with evidence. But when you just make a statement and then show a couple of clips, that doesn't really move me quite as much here. But I think when you get further and further into it, it starts to get into some narratives about him being selected number 1 overall, and there's a lot of weight that's put on the player's name. Doesn't really mean a lot to me here. But he says, he goes into film study on here, and he says, believe it or not, quarterbacks are still impacted by what is around them. I mean, obviously this is true. And it's a little bit of a pushback probably to people like myself who try to attribute everything, at least optically, to the quarterback, because we say, hey, here's the EPA per play when the quarterback's plays, and we're listing that next to the quarterback's names, where implicitly we all know that there's a lot more that goes into it, that it's the team's results on those plays. But then again, yards, touchdowns, everything else, that's all team results that go through on these plays. So, it's an appeal to, hey, we're going to go beyond the stats here. Okay, great. Interesting thing here from Nate here is that he says that Bryce Young has 3.68 adjusted net yards per attempt last season, which accounts for sack yardage, weighs touchdowns, and interceptions. So specifically, it includes sacks in the denominator with attempts. It takes out sack yardage, so it subtracts the sack yardage. It adds a 20-yard bonus for touchdowns and a 45-yard discount for interceptions. And it's one of the lowest numbers that we've seen. The other numbers that are the other sub-4 numbers that he lists here are Blaine Gabbert in 2011. That was probably Gabbert's rookie season, right? Let me just look it up to make sure. I think it was. Yes, it was his rookie season. So Blaine Gabbert in 2011. Blake Bortles in 2014. That was his rookie season. Jared Goff in 2016. That was his rookie season. But again, Goff on here, this is important context. When Goff's going to be held up as an example of someone who succeeded, just remember that Jared Goff as a rookie had 205 pass attempts. And Bryce Young as a rookie had 527 pass attempts. That's a pretty big difference. 200 pass attempts, you could conceivably get to that in like 5 games worth of work. It was 7 games for Goff, but you could get to there with 5 games. Brett Hundley in 2017, that was not his rookie year, I don't think, but that's when he came in when Aaron Rodgers got injured that year. Deshaun Kaiser in 2017, that was his rookie season. Carson Wentz in 2020, that was not his rookie season. That was when everything fell apart before he was traded to the Colts. And Zach Wilson in 2021, which was his rookie season. So we do have quite a few rookies in here. So Goff is the only one who ends up with a good career. But remember, the additional context that I'm putting in here is the fact that Goff is also the only one who didn't really throw that many passes in 2016. So, we could have an assumption that if he would have played even longer, if that season, let's say the season would have extended, or if he would have played earlier, if they didn't bring him if they didn't have him riding the pine for the first 6-7 weeks of the season, actually, I guess it was more than that. It was really the first 8 or 9 weeks of the season. If they didn't do that, then he would have been just as bad. But who knows? Jared Goff has proven to be a decent quarterback, so maybe he would have been better with more of a sample in that rookie season. So yeah, Goff's the only player who's been good. So that's something to keep in mind. I think this is important. This is actually the only part of the analysis that I may agree with, at least a little bit, but I think I gave a little bit more detail and obviously a bigger sample to look at when it comes to that. Now we get the anti-stats paragraph in here. Just staring at a player's statistics doesn't tell the whole story. I'm reading here from the article. Especially in football. Thank you for that. What you hope to see when a quarterback or player is in such a dire situation is glimpses of positive play despite the whirlwind of negativity around them. Was the process clean despite a lot of despites here, despite a less than ideal result? Was there an ability to mitigate a sack or avoid a negative play despite a free running pass rusher? Was it proper timing and ideal ball placement, even though, I like mixing it up, no despite here, there was a drop? Are you hunting explosive plays even in a muddy pocket? You hope for those little snippets of winning football despite the losses mounting up and bottom of the barrel box score numbers. Okay, so a little shot at nerds like myself who are just looking at box score here. But This is probably like a big fundamental difference between stats people and maybe film people. This is comes like this is probably part of the Justin Fields type of story too. Is performance is not for me, and I think this is probably true when you look through what actually happens in NFL games, especially if we're talking about a quarterback who's drafted number 1 overall, right? Is it really possible for someone to be bad, to be playing in the NFL and not have any hope, any little snippets of winning football? Like, who's the last guy that you could point to where you'd say that? Maybe you'd say that with Josh Rosen, but I bet someone wrote a Rosen article after his rookie season saying that there were some snippets in there. So it's not about like the difference between a quarterback who becomes great and a quarterback who doesn't become great. It's not about just having the ability to do certain things versus not do certain things. Unless we're talking about extraordinary things like what a Patrick Mahomes can do or a Josh Allen can do that like even other great quarterbacks can't do. It's about doing them consistently. You're always going to find snippets. That's part of the confirmation bias of this type of analysis is if you don't like Bryce Young, you're going to ignore those snippets and say, "Oh, those are one-off sorts of things," and I'm going to focus on a lot of the bad things that were happening. If you like Bryce Young, you're going to use those little snippets of good play to say, "Hey, there's hope." Now we did that for again. Justin Fields is the most recent guy I can really think of here because not a lot of people had any snippets actually for Zach Wilson. So maybe Zach Wilson's the guy. Maybe there's some, but then again, I'm mostly hearing from guys who didn't like Zach Wilson coming out. So there's a lot of confirmation bias. But when it came to Justin Fields and the confirmation bias, it's kind of like, well, he shows upside. If you can just do this more consistently, if you can just do that more consistently, well, guess what? Like doing it consistently is the difference. Not whether you can do it or not sometimes or never, but doing it consistently is the difference. So again, that's a different way that I would look at it versus how it's framed here. You know, he says this is going back to Tice's article here. What Young did show was some creation, accuracy, and a good understanding for operating the offense. What does that mean? I don't know. I'm assuming his accuracy numbers were crap. He took a lot of sacks and understanding the operating the offense. I mean, again, I don't know what this means. I don't know what any of this means. Like, it's not that I don't know what it means. Like theoretically, I just don't like. I can't buy in to what's being said here. When given a workable pocket, Young could put the ball on the money and was more than willing to attack the middle of the field. And to give an example of that, he shows a clip. What about give me his stats from a clean pocket, passes to the middle of the field, his accuracy stats? What were those? You know, give me more than a clip. But I'd imagine they weren't great, but I'm not sure. I don't know. When not smothered right away, Young showed off the tantalizing ability to create out of structure that drew Steph Curry comparisons and gave him so many fans throughout the draft process. The Steph Curry thing. Mahomes is maybe Steph Curry comparisons were okay. The worst ever was Steph Curry. I think it started with Le'Veon Bell comparing himself to Steph Curry, and then I actually heard some people parrot that. It was the worst. So he can create some stuff. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I kind of liked him coming out is he had some good pressured numbers, which I think is important. More of the stuff here. Quicker passes. There's not a lot of yak there. Not great arm strength. Blah, blah, blah. Is this anything that we didn't already know? The lack of juice. Okay, I'm going back to the offense here and what Tice is saying. The lack of juice from the Panthers led to so many tight windows for Young to throw into. Led to so many times but he would also sometimes work to underneath options too quickly. That's a weird sentence, but okay. Lack of juice from the Panthers. I guess that just means the guy's not getting open. Rather than letting a concept play out or pushing the ball for deeper options on high-low concepts, Young would too often defer to safer routes, even when given the time to operate in the pocket. So he threw a lot of check downs. At least he has that. He does have the check down number there. Although I might adjust that for like down and distance. Like I'm sure he's in a lot of third and longs, which probably there's a lot more checkdowns in those situations than for other quarterbacks who are passing on, 1st and 10. Success rate was low, a lot of short gains. Young's lack of arm strength, okay, at least this is something here, and size creates little room for error in his play. Well, that sounds bad. There's an extra hitch when he's getting rid of the ball. Sack rate is high. Blah, blah, blah. Space is key. He's putting in here. This is really somewhat interesting because one of his greatest strengths, his intelligence and understanding for playing the position, has ended up being a double-edged sword for him. They're saying that he drops back too deep, and that's kind of interesting. And yeah, I'm more so okay, here we go. Finally, we get to something here. What does this all mean for Young going forward? And again, like this is like the whole point, right? Is this the whole point of the analysis? Like I think that some of the other stuff is interesting, but I probably could have guessed like 90% of the stuff. Hey, he makes accurate throws sometimes, he doesn't other times. Doesn't have great arm strength. Took a lot of sacks, threw a lot of short passes. Like again, well, what are we getting from the film analysis that we're not getting from just looking at his stats? So what does this all mean for Young going forward? Going back to quoting the article here. Well, let's just say it's not exactly a rosy start to his professional career. Okay. It's a rough statistical profile, and his play wasn't overwhelming when I studied him. Yes. Well, it would be interesting. Like, give me a rough statistical profile where the play was overwhelming. Yes. I'm going back to this article here. Yes, former number one picks like Goff and Trevor Lawrence have overcome their horrid rookie years to become viable quarterbacks. I guess Lawrence might be a guy that people would point to as they liked what they saw, at least somewhat, for him. But then again, like, his stat, those adjusted net yards per attempt was pretty bad, 4.54. So they were pretty bad as a rookie, but not nearly as bad as what Young's numbers were to become viable quarterbacks, but those are the exceptions to the rule. And Lawrence showed more glimpses of high-end play during his rookie year, during the Urban Meyer experience, so the double during there, than Young did under Reich and the rest of the Panthers' funky bunch coaches. So I guess he's saying because he showed more flashes under Urban Meyer, then it's not to say that Young is a bust already either. His accuracy and intelligence still translate to every offense. I mean, clearly not. He stunk, and still give him a floor as a viable starter. Why is his floor a viable starter? He was horrible. That's not his floor. Like, I'm sorry. And better teammates like the newly acquired Deontay Johnson and explosive rookie wideout Xavier Leggett, should help highlight those traits even more. But you take a player number one overall to move the needle, not just to get the job done. Young has a path to be a quarterback who can keep an offense on time with some ad-libbing ability to add creativity and spice to an offense. He mentions Alex Smith as a comparison, but to justify the 1.1 selection, so first overall, Young have to push it even more in 2024 and beyond. I mean, I guess the point is like he's negative on him, but I would just explicitly maybe say that a little bit more. And I wouldn't give him a floor as a viable starter. I mean, that's ridiculous. He does not have a floor of a viable starter. It's much lower than that. And again, I don't know. I want something to dig my teeth into. And I thought this was an interesting contrast, at least to look at this article versus what I would have said on Young, which is not so hot, and get a really good statistical underpinning for who he's been so far. All right, let me go to the next article here. And this is the main one I want to focus on. I probably spent too much time talking about the last one with Young. But this is an interesting article from Dan Graziano. This is ESPN Plus. Hopefully they don't get mad at me sharing this exclusive content. It's called NFL Roster Building, GMs on Quarterback Deals, Salary Cap, Team Culture. Let's go ahead and read it. Before there was Michael Penix Jr., there was Jordan Love. 4 years before the Atlanta Falcons made the most confusing move of the 2024 draft, selecting Penix 8th after signing Kirk Cousins to big money 1 month earlier, the Green Bay Packers traded up in the first round to take Love. This set off a firestorm of criticism. How dare the Packers, with 36-year-old legend Aaron Rodgers still under contract for multiple seasons, use such valuable resources on a quarterback? They risked alienating Rodgers and could have used that pick on someone, and then in brackets, a receiver, who made the 2020 team better. And this is a quote from Packers GM Brian Gutekunst. You think about those things, but the value of the quarterback position in general really kind of trumps everything else. If you have the opportunity to get a quarterback, you have to take it. Now, I don't know. I think this is just like a bad analogy, really. I mean, taking a quarterback who falls to you in the 20s, who you may like, um, versus using the 8th overall pick is probably enough of a like a bad analogy. I mean, honestly, like a good analogy if you're talking about Kirk Cousins and ceilings and maybe have trading him later and a guy who's decent that you have currently but didn't show the ceiling. I mean, this is Aaron Rodgers versus Kirk Cousins in this situation. For as much as you like Cousins, we're not putting him in the Aaron Rodgers bucket, even if Aaron Rodgers had a couple of bad seasons. I guess a better analogy of you wouldn't want to use it necessarily is like the Patrick Mahomes, honestly, for like an Alex Smith type that's coming in, where you're trading up to the number 10 pick overall. You're using a lot of resources rather than just grabbing someone who falls to you. But anyway, bad analogy, but I guess it's what you want to use there. Jordan Love's the quarterback of the hour. Okay, back to the article. This is a core Packers philosophy rooted in the early 90s when then GM Ron Wolf, Elliot Wolf, I think, is there now. I don't know. He's his son. Established organizational priorities that still govern team decisions today. Even after trading for Brett Favre in February of 1992, what did they trade? A second round pick for Favre? Wolf drafted Heisman winning quarterback Ty Detmer in the 9th round of that year's draft. The following year, he drafted Mark Brunell in the 5th round. Over an 8-year stretch from 92 to 99, there was only 1 year, 1994, in which Wolf did not select a quarterback in the draft. Okay, I'm going to nitpick here again. Like, come on. The Packers, like, just stand on the fact that they drafted Aaron Rodgers when they still had Brett Favre playing okay, and they drafted Love when they still had Aaron Rodgers. Like, that's enough evidence here. This whole thing of like, oh, we drafted Ty Detmer in the 9th round, which doesn't even exist anymore. And the following year, we drafted Mark Brunell in the 5th round. I mean, they say this priority still stays until today. If you look at the Packers draft history, and I had to do this just because I want to see like how much this narrative actually lines up. So if you go before they drafted, well, first of all, let's look here. They drafted a quarterback in the 7th round this season, in the 5th round last season. Nobody in 2022, nobody in 2021. Jordan Love in 2020. But then look before Jordan Love here, right? This is like, oh, they're always drafting quarterbacks all the time. No quarterbacks the year before, no quarterbacks 2 years before, no quarterbacks 3 years before, no quarterbacks 4 years before. So it's 4 straight years they didn't take a single quarterback. And then they took Brent Huntley the year before that. And then the 2 years before Brent Huntley, they didn't take a quarterback. So these guys are not taking a quarterback every year. This is not like some big organizational philosophy. If anything, if you wanted to point to a team where I think has more of an argument for that, was probably the New England Patriots when they had Brady and they were still using like real draft picks on quarterbacks, not just, 4th and 5th rounders. If you go back, Jarrett Stidham, I guess 4th rounder in 2019, so that doesn't count that much. But if you go back, Jacoby Brissett, a 3rd rounder in 2016, Jimmy Garoppolo, a 2nd rounder in 2014, Ryan Mallett, a 3rd rounder in 2011, Kevin O'Connell, a 3rd rounder in 2008. I mean, that's actually more of a commitment to drafting quarterbacks than the Packers. But again, I'm nitpicking here. I'm digressing. I'm getting in the way of the narrative here, which doesn't really fit that much. Okay, back to Gutekunst. You just never know when you're going to need one, said Gutekunst, who joined the Packers as a scout in 1999. We were lucky here for years that Brett and Aaron stayed healthy, but you never know. So you're really protecting the organization. Drafting quarterbacks, developing quarterbacks protects the organization. Again, this narrative doesn't really work that well with what they've done. But anyway, the Love pick worked out on multiple levels. Rodgers earned MVP honors as the Packers won 13 games and the NFC North title in each of his next 2 seasons. So Rodgers had a big bounce back. Because remember, Rodgers was kind of bad from 20 well, I guess he was kind of not great in 2015, good in 2016, bad in 2017, 18, 19. He just wasn't playing that well, even though they were winning games. And then he came back and boom. I guess maybe you could say the Love pick worked out motivating Rodgers to get to those 2 MVPs, but then all of a sudden that jumped back up again. After dipping to 8 and 9 in 2022, they traded Rodgers to the New York Jets and installed Love as the starter, and he led them to the 2nd round of the playoffs last season. Okay, finally, we got through that trying to shoehorn in this Jordan Love Packers thing into this discussion. Finding the right QB is just one piece of NFL roster building, a year-round jigsaw puzzle for decision makers. Ideas on the best ways to build a contender vary from team to team. The Packers' approach has worked well for them, but is by no means the only way to do it. Over the past several weeks, in interviews with a dozen NFL GMs, we tried to pull back the curtain on how NFL teams construct their rosters, digging deep on quarterbacks, contract structure, draft philosophies, free agent theories, and the importance of culture. No one claims to have it all figured out, but there are a few common threads. And for most teams, it all starts in the same place. Okay. Common threads. Yeah, I think that's kind of interesting. That's what we want to stick with here. I don't like the idea where there's not only one way to do it. I remember that was a very particular criticism of the process and Sam Hinkie. It's like, well, the Warriors did it a different way. The other teams did it a different way. Yeah, like no one's saying there is no such thing as the only way to do anything. It's just you're trying to increase your odds to have the best chance of being successful, which is still low because there are 32 teams in the NFL. Okay, finding the right quarterback. Teams find themselves in different quarterback situations. Okay, well, that's a pretty self-evident statement. Do you have a quarterback who's still on a rookie deal, a veteran getting paid 50 million plus annually, or something in the middle? Is your guy the long-term answer? Can you win with him? Will you win because of him? Obviously, the quarterback is number one. Tampa Bay Buccaneers GM Jason Licht said. I feel like it should be Licht, Licht, but he goes by Light. I think Licht is actually the correct pronunciation, but he doesn't like to be called Licht, probably. And if the correct meaning, like it's like someone whose last name is Wiener, but then they go by Weiner or something like that. It's like, sorry, dude, your name's Wiener. Okay. And if in the draft a quarterback is going to be lights out, like he's going to be a Patrick Mahomes or Joe Burrow, you'd offer literally 10 first-round picks for that guy. It wouldn't matter. It would be worth it, but it's such a crapshoot. Okay, well, that's true. Licht has lived multiple iterations of the quarterback continuum. Okay, so I'm going to start skipping forward a little bit here. So Jameis Winston first, and then signing Tom Brady, taking a low-risk shot on Baker Mayfield, and then re-signing him to a huge contract. Most of the talent on the 2020 Buccaneers roster was homegrown, a testament to the draft and develop method of roster building on which every franchise tries to learn as much as possible. Yeah, so every team is trying to draft and develop. I agree with that. It's like the only way to do it, really, for the best cost savings in the way things work with free agency. So, yeah, like if you want to give someone extra credit for drafting and developing, it's like, you're kind of just giving them extra credit for getting lucky in some ways. Brandon Bean comes in here. Can you win a championship with the quarterback? What are you required to pay him? And then the next paragraph here talking about the salary cap says the NFL is a salary cap league. And even with the cap at a record high $255.4 million for 2024, teams with big money quarterbacks have to make tough decisions elsewhere on their rosters to accommodate that salary. Bills quarterback Josh Allen's cap number last season was $18.6 million. This year, it's $30.4 million, which would be the 8th highest in the league among quarterbacks. It's interesting how they do QBs in here and they don't spell out quarterbacks as part of this style guide. It's scheduled to go up to $43.2 million in 2025 and $63.9 million in 2026. Yes, GMs can restructure or extend to dance around the cap rules, but they still have to budget around a big number, which is one reason the Bills traded Stephon Diggs, moved on from higher-priced veterans like Tre'Davious White and Mitch Morse this offseason. I mean, it's one reason, but it's not like a big reason. $30.4 million for Josh Allen is a bargain. Absolute bargain. And they'll probably, like I said, they're probably going to restructure, so he's not going to go up next year. So I don't think Josh Allen has really prevented him from doing anything. It was really signing a bunch of guys to a bunch of big contracts like Stephon Diggs himself that didn't work out. It's injuries for Tre'Davious White. It's Von Miller's free agency, which was, not great, that free agent signing. The average 2024 cap hit for the 10 highest paid quarterbacks is $42.19 million. Seems very high. or about 16.5% of the cap. There's a wide range there. Deshaun Watson with the league high number at $63.8 million accounts for 25% of the Browns salary cap. They'll likely restructure his deal this summer to knock that number down. That's what it says here from Graziano. When you think about that, actually restructuring, knocking the number down, freeing up cap space, because it's so late in the year, you don't really have an ability to do much with it this year, but you can roll it over in the NFL to next year. Jared Goff, who's $27.2 million, is currently the 10th highest, accounts for 11% of the Detroit Lions cap. Is that what his number is after this extension? I don't know. Anyway, more from Bean talking about 24% of the cap. So he says if it's 24%, the Bills, Brandon Bean here. You have to think a little bit more. You have to think, is this the type of quarterback that you're cutting back elsewhere? When you're talking about 1/4 of the cap, you're thinking that's over the line for me. So it's about what tier is your quarterback in and where do you draw that line? I mean, all pretty self-evident sort of things. And again, Brandon Bean, as I've discussed before in this podcast, should be thanking the heavens that he has Josh Allen, that he doesn't have to think about that as hard as some other GMs do. The Los Angeles Rams drew the line in 2021 after selecting Goff with the top pick in 2016, reaching the Super Bowl with him as their starter in 2018, and then rewarding him with a 4-year, $134 million extension in the summer of 2019. The Rams looked at their roster and decided Goff was not the guy to get them over the top. They traded him to the Lions in a deal that brought Matthew Stafford in 2021. What's interesting about that extension for Goff and also the extension for Wentz is, those didn't really set the market, which is kind of a different atmosphere. I think about Goff and the money he's making now. Like, I think it looks even better relative to the market now, Goff's new contract, than it did when he extended before, which is just kind of shows you some of the disbelief in Goff, even though I think he led the NFL in his second or third year in adjusted net yards per attempt. And Wentz had the injuries, which kept his number down. Okay, this is Les Snead, Rams GM. You have to assess what phase of the quarterback are you in. Are you still figuring it out if he's the one? At the time, some of our core players, most of them were in their prime, were looking at the last 4 or 5 years of their careers. I mean, NFL players are kind of always looking at the last 4 or 5 years of their careers, potentially. And they were kind of ready to take advantage of it now. So we were always going to need a quarterback who wasn't just starting his own career. Jared was probably not there yet, whereas Matthew had made the climb. So he was a very specific piece of the puzzle for our group. Stafford's salary cap number that year, after the Rams restructured his contract, came in at $20 million. Fortunately, LA was already thinking about how to build around an 8-figure quarterback cap number, having extended Goff 2 years earlier. Once we're paying top dollar, we knew we were going to have to rely on players that were on rookie contracts to be Robins to the Batman, Snead said. Yeah, that's one way of putting it. Although a $20 million cap, it doesn't seem that bad. Identifying value and knowing when to spend. A mythology labeled F them picks. Okay, first of all, I have to give myself some credit here. Let me jump in and give myself some credit here. F them picks. That's me. That was me. I even have it. I have it here for you guys so you can see it because I wanted to bring it up just so we'll share this tab instead. Here we go. October 15th, 2019, 9:03 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The picture, F them picks, that I put out when the Rams traded for Jalen Ramsey. This is the exact picture that ends up on Les Snead's shirt and everything else that came in there. So I feel like I should be getting some. Can I get some royalties off of this or something? Probably not, since I stole the picture and stole the concept from the Michael Jordan F them kids thing. But anyway, your boy right here. I was the one who did this. Okay, so sprung up around the Super Bowl champion Rams. Snead and the organization leaned into it and had a whole bunch of fun with the perception that they were the ultimate forget the future, win now team. But as often the case, it was an oversimplification. Yes, the Rams had built the top end of the roster by trading away first and second round picks for the likes of Stafford, Jalen Ramsey, and Von Miller. But in the 5 years leading up to their title, the Rams actually made 45 draft picks, more than every other team except the Minnesota Vikings. They collected mid-round and late-round picks by strategically working the compensatory pick formula and used them in very directed ways. So there's a couple different things that come in here. I do think that's true. And they're getting a ton of picks. The 49ers are getting a ton of compensatory picks. They make a huge difference. You can hit on those picks. Not only does it give you more chances to hit, but they have very, very low salaries for rookies, which ends up working very well. But also, you know what they did is they hit on like the Aaron Donalds of the world, like a non-quarterback who doesn't get injured and has this like extended prime. And we talk about a prime, we're talking about, best non-quarterback in the NFL type of prime. That really helps a ton on what you can do. I mean, ultimately, they ended up completely throwing the bag at him, Donald, and it kind of blew up in their face and retirement and everything else now. But it really helped extend what they could do for a long time. It's similar to what the Saints were able to do. So having a lot of draft picks, more picks is better. Like this is, even though they weren't first round picks, they had a lot of picks. That helps. Taking more shots helps. It's kind of the flip side of the same equation where we're talking about trading back and getting a lot of picks, right? It's not that first round picks won't hit more often, but having multiple shots at small amounts can really help you work around some of these things. This is Sneed talking here. I think the volume helps, talking about picks. But also when you have a roster like we had, you can say, if these players stay healthy, and this is kind of what I'm talking about, we know we're going to be in it. It's a lot easier to step back and see, okay, we have a void at specific positions. Now, what skill do these players need to be able to come in and contribute? We ended up probably tilting towards older players who played 4 years, guys with a high floor, instead of more upside guys. So that's talking about in the draft. That's interesting. That's an interesting way of looking at it. I don't know. I mean, when you're picking the later rounds, I think there's probably a tilt towards guys who played 4 years more often, but I would definitely go for more underclassmen looking earlier in the years. Okay, he cites a couple examples. Good job. You hit on a couple of picks. Sneed suggested the key was front office discipline on a number of levels. Is that ever not the key? The discipline to pass on exciting players with upside in favor of ones who bring the specific traits. The discipline to let a player you like leave in free agency. Now, that is important. That's a very, very important one. Again, it goes back to the comp picks here. Knowing a compensatory pick would be coming, the discipline to actually play young mid-round draft picks alongside veterans. Yeah, sometimes it's like the genius of necessity. When you have a lot of guys on big contracts and you got to play some of these mid-rounders because you don't have early picks, sometimes they can end up surprising you and being even better than you thought. So it's weird because the Rams have always been this team where I don't think you want to do like the F them pick sort of model, but at the same time, being willing to let players go, using compensatory picks, doing that sort of stuff is all stuff that I love. Okay, more from Sneed here. The question is, can you, in an unbiased way as an organization, identify what window you're in? Sneed said. I think it'd be more like, okay, let me continue. Sorry. Are you building? Have you broken through? Are you now in this contending window? If you're building, you certainly don't give up a second round and a third round pick for a player who might only be there a few months. Okay, he's talking about Von Miller, of course, here is what they gave up if you're building. Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of obvious. Some do that anyway. Oh, it's interesting. Well, they re-signed Montez Sweat, so I wouldn't put that in the same category. But anyway, at the 2023 trade deadline, Chicago Bears GM Ryan Poles shipped a second-round pick to the Washington Commanders for edge rusher Montez Sweat, who was in the final year of his contract. A few days later, the Bears signed him to a 4-year, $98 million extension. They paid a premium for the 27-year-old, but Poles believes it's important to recognize when it's worth stretching for a player. This is Poles talking here. Kind of knowing when to hit the gas and when to hit the brake, Poles said. You look at age, production. We saw the talent on tape and then looked at the age and knew that provided a runway for the player to come up in our organization. You want to do everything in a very disciplined way, that word again, but you also know you don't have forever. Okay, this is a more interesting thing here. It speaks to somewhat of the timelines of GMs, especially Poles, who came into a little bit of a shit show and took a year just to reshuffle things and then another year to play out Justin Fields. And now going into year 3, being at the end of year 2 when they made this trade. Yeah, I agree with him there. These contracts start running out, and organizationally, you have to show improvement if you want to convince everyone to stick with the plan. everyone being the owner right there. Also, at last year's trade deadline, Seattle Seahawks GM John Schneider traded a second round pick to the New York Giants for defensive tackle Leonard Williams, who was in the final year of his deal. Yeah, Seattle is a little bit more in these in between things where that was probably not great. In March, Seattle re-signed Williams for 3 years and 64.5 million. After trading such a high pick for the player, Schneider basically had to sign him this spring. But Williams had played well, and Schneider believed he had earned the new contract, even if he wasn't in Seattle's long-range plan at this time last year. It was a lesson Schneider says he learned years ago when Russell Wilson aged out of his rookie quarterback deal as Seattle started to plan ahead on other areas of the roster. Knowing it would be tough to keep the famed Legion of Boom secondary together, Snyder started trying to find those players' replacements in the draft a year or two before their contracts were up. Roster building is never like this clean slate, Snyder said. People say, start from within, And yeah, that's awesome. But if you're drafting well, are you going to let Earl Thomas just leave because you can sign Cam Chancellor? No, you keep your best players. Some of the mistakes I've made were looking at, well, Earl and Cam are coming up, so you have to draft their replacements. Now you're pushing those players up your board artificially, and that's how we drafted Tedrick Thompson. Poor Tedrick Thompson getting thrown under the bus here. When we should have drafted George Kittle. Philosophically, where you make your biggest mistakes in the draft is when you're drafting for need. Now, I'll agree with that quote, but what I would say is we're talking about safeties here, right? Cam Chancellor and Earl Thomas. Like, get those guys in free agency, and then you don't make those mistakes. Get safeties in free agency, and then you don't make those mistakes. And I know, like, ideally you like to have even cheaper guys on those contracts, but, whatever. Kittle's going to be like a common example, I think, for the rest of history because he was taken in the 5th round. And I'm sure everyone had a draftable grade on him. At least they should with his athleticism. So it's like every team on the planet could be like, oh man, we were so close to drafting George Kittle, but we didn't take him. That's going to be one. Of course, drafting Thompson in the 4th round. Again, we're talking about 4th round pick here, so it's not even that big of a deal. In the 4th round in 2017 made sense at the time, with Seattle anticipating that Thomas would be moving on shortly thereafter, leaving a void at safety. Again, safety. Take them in free agency. But looking back, the Seahawks would have been better off taking Kittle, who went in the 5th round, even uh, year, uh, that has a QB on a veteran deal. You do have to look at ways where you can find relative value in other areas of roster construction, Browns GM Andrew Berry said. Now, Andrew Berry's going to have to really figure that out with Deshaun Watson's cap hits coming up on that guaranteed contract. Then it's about where are the other areas where you can find strategic advantages? How do you structure certain deals? When do you engage in extension talks with your current players you want to keep? How do you manage your spending on a multi-year basis? The general manager's responsibility is to have a foot in the present and a foot in the future. And depending on where you are in your roster's life cycle, that can determine how hard you lean into one or the other of those. Now, my question would be for that, all this stuff is depending upon where you are in the roster's life cycle. Does the same GM ever get through multiple cycles and lean into the down part of the cycle after being through the up part? I mean, you have to have built up a lot of credibility to make it through that down part in the cycle. So that's what I find is kind of interesting. Like, think about Andrew Berry for one. Like, when is he going to be in the position where he's like, you know what? We're not building anymore. We're in the down part of the cycle. So let's sell everything off. Like, it's very easy to do when you first start as a GM doing something like that. A little bit more difficult to do once you've been in the job for a little bit to say, we got to like show some results here. I think Barry's done some interesting things as far as signing veterans who are in the middle of their rookie contract. Well, not signing, trading for veterans who are in the middle of their rookie contract window and trying to get some cost savings there. But at the same time, the Elijah Moores of the world, I'm not sure they've been that valuable. And they're just going to be like renegotiating and extending and restructuring that Deshaun Watson contract forever and just hoping that he can play well. Navigating the salary cap, new section here of the article. Okay, this is starting to get long, so we're not going to go through everything here. But I think it's pretty interesting. They talk about there's a role for assistant GM Mike Greenberg for the Buccaneers, where he talks about not only working with Jason like on the contracts, but how to think about it multiple years in the future. There are defined principles of contract structure that vary from team to team. Cincinnati Bengals have a long-standing practice of not guaranteeing any money beyond the signing bonus, aka being extremely cheap because their owners are not that wealthy. They also mentioned the Raiders not really doing that, and the Steelers were another team who didn't really do that. Again, cheap, 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 not wealthy, not wealthy, not wealthy. That's becoming a bigger differentiator now in the NFL. They don't really mention it here, but they mention it kind of obliquely here that there's these huge money owners coming into the NFL now where it's going to make a big difference. And the Eagles, they give it as an example, an owner with a little bit more money there, where they're just like can kicking forever on Jalen Hurts, which I think is really interesting in contrast to Carson Wentz, who they were able to get out from under. They're not going to be able to get out from under this particular contract. In terms of preferred structure, this is Brandon Beane talking. Every GM's got to understand ownership, what they want, where they are flush with cash, where they are not. Some teams might sign a player and pay 3/4 of the bonus up front, while others might spread it out over 12 months. If you have to look out long term for where your dollars are going to be, what's it going to cost you in year 2, 4, 6 of that deal? Where are the spikes in the deal? And make sure you don't put yourself in a position where you're going to have too many guys spiking in the same year. I mean, that's kind of where the Bills found themselves, quite honestly, here. But I think another way to think about this signing bonus is that there is a legitimate advantage to teams that have owners who are willing to spend a bunch of money and spend it up front. Sure, you're giving yourself maybe a little bit less flexibility in the future, but those are sunk costs, right? A lot of the time. But if you're able to spend a ton of money in cash, give it that cash to the player today, the player values the cash like they value cash more so because they're getting it today. And then you're spreading out that cap hit over a number of years where the cap's going up. So that cost is like you're inflating, the inflation of the cap is lowering the percentage of the cap. I mean, you're basically able to give someone more money and the cumulative cost to the cap is less because you're paying them and you're stringing these things out over a number of years. I mean, it's a pure financial alchemy that ends up being an advantage. You know, you can just spend more money and then string it out over time and potentially sign players to contracts that give them a little bit less overall, but give them more money up front, which they will value if they're smart, right? Time value of money. It's worth more now. So there's a lot of strategic advantages to having these owners who can spend a lot of money. We'll see in the future whether or not it becomes a bigger deal. It's always going to be like a incremental and peripheral, not peripheral, but a marginal difference in a lot of these deals and contracts, but it is something that's going to matter over time as owners get richer and richer. All right, building the culture. Can I just skip this section? I probably should, but I'll read some of this. As several of the GMs interviewed said, a big part of the culture piece of roster building requires honest self-assessment of your building's infrastructure. What kind of support staff does the team have? Who are the veterans on the roster who will have the strongest influence on the player? Who are the coaches? This is Schneider talking. It's evaluating your evaluators. How good are your area scouts discerning stuff? What are the interviews telling you? Have you ever noticed that I've already noticed that like these are all questions. Like the interviews are just the GMs giving you a whole bunch of questions. You have to evaluate the coach. Who's going to be the coach in the player? You have to evaluate. Okay, yeah, you have to. This is interesting here from Ryan Poles, and I wonder whether this is actually a net positive or negative. But Poles says he keeps a decision log in which he records every decision he has made since becoming the Bears GM and what he's learned from it. An example, he says, is what kind of impact a good, respected veteran at a key position can have on the rest of the roster. And he's talking about, they got Montez Sweat, and then all of a sudden their defense was awesome. And he says, we added Montez. There was a different feel to our defense. I didn't realize the impact it could have when you have a dude, in italics here, at a premium position like that. Other players' confidence and swagger changed once they had a dude up front. And just the accountability. Guys don't want to let down a guy like that. I think it's good probably overall for the decision log, but if you're like resting too much on the very, very low sample that we're talking about here. It may not be great, but interesting at least. Poles also said his approach to this past offseason changed once they knew they were going to draft Caleb Williams, and then they traded for Keenan Allen, blah, blah, blah. We get it. Okay, this is an interesting quote from this is an interesting point from Graziano here, which I don't necessarily agree with. There are coaches and GMs whose track records tell us they're good at the draft or good at spotting and acquiring talent. But in the end, the only way it's all going to work is if that team's building is set up to sustain success. If there's a continuity and consistency in the decision making and a team spirit behind all aspects of roster construction. Number one, there's very little about GMs and coaches' track records that really tell us how great they are at spotting and acquiring talent. So that's number one. Number two, all these things about is the team's building set up to sustain success? The problem with that is, like, how do you think about that independent of whether or not there is success? Or how do you look at that prospectively rather than retrospectively? It's kind of one of my things is, you know what a winning culture is? A team that wins has a winning, by definition, has a winning culture. Teams that don't win don't have a winning culture. Like if a winning culture is in and of itself something, then how many teams have are losing but have winning cultures that you can point to? Can you identify them now? Or vice versa? How many teams are winning that have losing cultures that you know that things are going to fall off? And do they fall off because of that? Again, very easy after the fact to look at these things. What it's like to set up a building for sustained success. Well, guess what? It's a building that's had sustained success. That's how that's what it looks like. Now, is one thing leading to the other? Is one thing predictive of the other? I don't know. You can't even give me like parameters, and there's all these different ways of building a building with sustained success. So this again, look at the Seattle Seahawks leaning so hard on draft and develop model. Again, everyone's leaning on that model. Why has Seattle been able to sustain a program that effectively trains the replacements for veterans who age out? And this is Schneider talking here. Coaches buy-in. That's why they've been able to do it. When you're drafting players and the coaches are kind of like, then maybe they're not going to spend as much time developing the guy because they don't really feel like he's their guy. So you have to have buy-in from the staff. Like, okay, here are Richard Sherman's deficiencies, but here are all of his strengths. So let's work to accentuate his strengths and we'll have a great player. There's something to that. You definitely want to have buy-in, but you also hear these stories of when, I remember there was a story in particular for Sashi Brown, and he was telling, he didn't mention the receiver, but it was obviously Corey Coleman, about how they drafted Corey Coleman. Everyone was on board with it. And then like 2 weeks into rookie camp, they're like, forget about this guy. He stinks. We don't want him. The coaches. Gutekunst is going back to Gutekunst here, blah, blah, blah. Okay, anyway, so that's kind of the end of the article here. It finishes with Gutekunst talking where he says, a lot of it is just opportunity. The opportunity to play in games. I agree with that. Okay, here we go. So this is what they say. It says, but Gutekunst's team managed a smooth transition with a number of young players around Love last season, and he didn't chalk it up to those players' talent or pre-draft evaluations. A lot of it is just opportunity. The opportunity to play and to play in games. He said, Ted Thompson, the former Packers GM, was really good about that, clearing the deck so a guy could get the opportunity to play. And then if you have a coaching staff that's really tuned into the development of players and having confidence to put them out there as young guys, living with their mistakes because they know the payoff, that's a big deal. Okay, now that I think that's actually a big thing here. Getting guys in, letting them play, even if they haven't looked that good in practice necessarily, I think is important sometimes. You really don't get anything as much as game time. I remember Deshaun Watson when he started off, and they didn't want to start him initially. Now they made the move like halfway into the first game, but because he didn't look great initially. Well, sometimes you got to just get him in there and get him the opportunity to play. And I think that's important. And creating those opportunities is also important for some of these younger players, and just having duplication at different positions. So you create that opportunity, you give them some opportunity, and then you're able to give someone else some opportunity without, freaking out over every little mistake, which unfortunately, that's kind of the job of coaches when they're put in the position that they are. All right. That's the article. Let me look in the old comments here, see if we have any questions that need answering. Otherwise, I'll blow out of here. Um, what would be okay? Here we go. Uh, QA. What would be your philosophy on hiring an NFL head coach? What qualities would you look for? That's an interesting one. I think that from what I've seen, and I know there was research done, I don't know a lot. So let me just caveat this whole discussion with it. I don't know a lot, but I know there's research been done on detail oriented being extremely important. So you want to find someone who's very detailed oriented. You're going to want to do a ton of background information and checks and interviews to find that out. You want someone who's clearly open to adjusting their opinions, updating their priors, being open to the analytical sort of stuff and building all through all that sort of thing. Someone who has an understanding of the role that luck and variance plays in things, but also knowing that you have to go full pedal to the metal with what you have at every time. So the coach is being able to weigh those two things, I think is important. Does it have to be someone who's experienced or not? I mean, there's definitely data out there that shows that experienced past successful head coaches are more likely to be successful in the future. So you do want to look at that, although they may not have some of the other qualities that you want as far as the openness is concerned. So it's kind of weighing all those things. Offense versus defense, all that sort of stuff. I'm not really that concerned about it because I do think you can find, new offensive coordinators a little bit more so maybe than some others think in that regard. Um, when talking about what position to take in free agency, are you just referring to non-premium positions? Yes. It's an easier fix, right? It's an easier fix if you say, we got a couple of safeties who are going to be aging out here. What should we do? So you don't reach in the draft at safety, get some safeties, especially safety. All day long, I'm getting safeties in free agency versus the draft. I think GMs are overthinking the roster life cycle, the roster life cycle thing, mainly because of how much uncertainty there is in evaluating teams. Yeah, it's probably true. Last comment here. Houston was supposed to be garbage, but then the rest of their roster suddenly looked decent for 2023, for example. Yeah, it's interesting with the Houston, like this is a pretty good one where it's like, how do we think about culture in these sort of ways? Because there's a couple of people who I interact with on the Twitter machine, the Twitter bot, who are adamant about the fact that D'Amico Ryans and everyone else came in and kind of set a new standard and tone and discipline and organization. And that's like led to the sustainability and why he should have been considered, coach of the year candidate and all those sorts of things. And I'm like, I don't know. Like they drafted CJ Stroud where they could have drafted Bryce Young if CJ Stroud went earlier. How would things have gone this year? I don't know. Probably would have gone better for Young, and it probably would have gone worse for Stroud than it did when they're flipped around. But I think it's just really, really hard to point out after the fact that someone's doing something and it's successful that we don't know whether or not it's because of them, like the whole winning culture thing. Yeah, they established a winning culture. Yeah, I'm sure every single new head coach comes in and does their interview, that coaching interview, and says, "Oh yeah, we're coming in. We're going to get the culture. We're going to do culture and get culture and get culture." Like I just think the bar is probably high for that sort of thing across the league. And then the players matter a lot. The front office matters, which didn't change, right? In Houston, matters a lot. All these other things matter a lot. New comments. We got a new comment here. A Q&A. Okay, let's get another Q&A here. A big narrative is that task one for a GM is to make stars happy. What are your thoughts on this? Do you just let Mahomes pick a first-round running back every couple of years? Yeah, I had a joke about that it's probably plus EV if you can get him to sign for a better contract, a pretty generous contract like you have. I don't know. Okay. It's not that I don't believe that it's a thing. And this comes to like my philosophy on a lot of different questions. It's not that I don't believe making your stars happy helps. Like versus not making them happy. Yeah. All else being equal, I would rather pick players who the coaches and the stars, current stars on the team want to have on their team. Um, that sounds good, but there's a cost to that, right? So then it's just weighing, and this is where I would normally sit in a lot of these questions. I would say, since we don't really have the evidence in one direction, how much it helps making your coaches and players happy, we don't have that much evidence. It's wrought with hindsight bias and confirmation bias and everything else with that. We don't have that evidence, but we do have the evidence of like reaching for a player, how much that potentially costs, drafting a non-premium position over a premium position, how much that potentially costs. And we know those things with not certainty, but a much higher degree of certainty than the other things. Then I'm going to lean towards the things that we know a little bit more than the crowd. I'm not going to totally ignore what the crowd believes, but I'm going to say, you know what, the crowd is probably wrong about it being so important. And I'm going to lean against it somewhat. And that, comes to my philosophy with a lot of different things. Who was the receiver that Aaron Rodgers fell in love with and specifically called the Packers for cutting? God, I don't remember now, but he went to the Bills is all I remember. Let's look at Rodgers, receiver, cut, Bills. I remember going to the Bills. Jake Kumaro. Yeah. Jake Kumaro. Oh, Jake Kumaro. Or if you're the Bears, draft Rome Odunze and make Caleb Williams happy when he's been on the team for 20 minutes. Yeah, I think it's probably just like the right pick to do no matter what. So it's fine in that regard. But again, we have so much hindsight bias is built into everything that, when I'm trying to think of another guy. Okay, another guy was maybe actually hasn't been that bad. But it gets on my radar when, of course we have the CEH pick where it was attributed somewhat to Mahomes, maybe. And then Rashee Rice is attributed somewhat to Mahomes there too. It could be going 0 for 2 on those. Not that Rashee Rice is a bad player, but he was off some people's boards. So maybe listening to Mahomes didn't help out so much there. Colts draft history. Who was it? There was one like behind the scenes one with Chris Ballard and Frank Reich where he was kind of doing it for Reich. Who was it? Hold on. Let me find this. Sorry, I don't think it's even that bad of a player necessarily. No, let's go back. Alex Pierce, no. Pittman, no. Paris Campbell, that's who it was. So in the second round, they were sitting there and he was doing the Paris Campbell thing. And I was like, I don't know. I mean, I guess I just don't like the offensive weapon types from Ohio State and those sorts of guys. I mean, Paris Campbell, he's not like the worst second round pick they've ever had. He's on the Eagles now. Actually, he's pretty bad. He did have 623 yards though, on his fourth year of his rookie contract. Wow. I guess he got injured. He really has not done much. So that was a pretty bad pick. But I remember seeing that one and thinking to myself, I don't know about that. Like, you don't have to like satisfy Frank Reich. Like, just get some good players and then he'll be satisfied. Not these offensive weapon merchant types. Anyway, but then I'm also suffering from confirmation bias because I don't believe in that stuff. So when I see a team do it, then I remember it. And then if it busts, I'm like, aha. Whereas if it would have gone well, I wouldn't have, jumped on it as much. So I don't want to get on it too much. Anyway, all right, that's it for today. Hope you guys enjoyed the podcast. Shoot me a note at, I guess it's unexpected_PTS@gmail.com or on Twitter, Kevin Cole _. Otherwise, I'll be talking to everyone next week. Thank you so much. Take it easy.